We all love stories about things just exploding, right?
Hmm.
Rapid growth, viral stuff online. You hear rapid, you think overnight success.
Yeah, instantaneous.
Exactly. But what if I told you some of the most incredible, seemingly rapid multiplication movements out there are actually built on something really slow, painstaking even?
It's a great point, a real paradox. This appearance of speed that actually hides a very deep, very deliberate process underneath.
Okay, let's get into this.
So today we're doing a deep dive into exactly that. We're exploring these concepts, church planting movements, CPMs, and disciple-making movements, or DMMs.
And we've got this fantastic source for our deep dive. It's from someone who was actually in the room when the term church planting movement was first being talked about and coined.
Right, so it gives this unique perspective, doesn't it? When the origins, the nature of these movements,
Yeah.
it really tracks the journey from, well, pretty humble starting points to the more complex way we understand them now.
So our mission here is to pull this source apart, understand how these ideas and these approaches developed, and really try to figure out what actually drives this kind of multiplication.
And critically, yeah, how dealing with failure and having this intense focus on specific things turned out to be absolutely key.
Because this isn't just about, defining terms. It feels more like a story, learning through unexpected results, challenging assumptions.
Yeah, discovering powerful principles through actual trial and error, not just theory.
It's about getting our heads around a different way of thinking about growth, isn't it?
It really is. So, okay, the source takes us back to the beginning.
Where did CPM come from?
Well, it came out of these meetings. Mission practitioners, strategists, all grappling with the Great Commission in Matthew 28, go make disciples, baptize, teach obedience.
Right.
They were trying to find words for these patterns of growth they were seeing in different places. Remarkable patterns.
And what's amazing reading this is how modest they were at the start. The goal wasn't thousands of churches.
Not at all. It was literally just establishing one beachhead church in places known for being super resistant or, inaccessible.
Just one. Success was defined as one single church, starting where there was nothing before.
Exactly. And they genuinely didn't think more than one was even possible in some of these really tough spots. That tells you something, doesn't it? About how hard they thought the task was.
So they were just trying stuff, hoping something would stick.
Pretty much. Our source talks about their own experience being one of the first trying to reach this specific resistant group. And they're very honest. They say they had no clue how to make it happen.
I really appreciate that honesty. It makes it more real. And they say what eventually worked, what made them seem successful, wasn't some perfect blueprint.
No. It was taking risks, trying new things constantly, and maybe the biggest thing, not being afraid of failure.
If something bombed, they just tried something else.
Exactly. Didn't dwell on it, moved on. Now, they did have training research methods, evangelism techniques, prayer networks, security, comms systems.
So they weren't just winging it entirely.
No, not entirely. But their research showed a massive problem. They couldn't directly reach the people they were targeting. History of resisting outsiders.
Okay. So faced with that, what do you do?
Well, this is where the big lessons came. Lessons learned, the source says, through many failures, which they actually credit God with teaching them.
And what were those lessons?
Two huge ones. First, the focus had to shift. It couldn't be about making followers of a specific church brand or denomination. It had to be about making disciples of Christ.
Okay, hold on. That sounds subtle, but is it? Making disciples of Jesus versus followers of my church. What difference did that make, practically?
It was massive, apparently.
Yeah.
It let them get past some of the baggage, the historical resistance people had towards outside religious institutions. Instead, they could just focus on Jesus, his person, his teachings.
Okay, that makes sense. And the second lesson?
Teaching these new disciples to obey Jesus' commands directly from him, not primarily church rules or denominational traditions.
Wow. So shifting the focus of obedience entirely onto Jesus himself, away from human structures, that feels like a really fundamental change.
It was. And the source is clear. That shift, focusing on Christ and simple obedience to his commands, is what unlocked everything.
Yeah, for all the failures.
Yes. That's what led, they say, to more than 80,000 churches, starting among this group everyone thought was unreachable.
80,000. From aiming for just one, that's staggering.
It really is. And it shows how that shift in focus resonated in a way the previous approaches just didn't.
So, okay, once they started seeing these totally unexpected, massive results, The language started to catch up, right? The definitions evolved.
Absolutely. Like we said, CPM started as just an observation, spontaneous churches starting without the missionary being directly involved. Kind of descriptive.
But then they needed something more solid for training people, right?
Exactly. As they tried to replicate it, they needed a tighter definition. So they developed these key elements for what counts as a true CPM.
Let's list those. What were they?
Okay, it had to be indigenously led gospel planting, based on an obedience-based discipleship process, resulting in at least 100 new, locally started and led churches.
Okay.
Reaching at least 4 generations deep. So churches starting churches starting churches.
Right, that multiplication depth.
And all that happening within about 3 years.
That's a high bar. And the source mentioned how many met that criteria.
At the time of writing, they said 68 movements globally fit that specific, rigorous definition. But even as they used church planting movement, they ran into a snag with the word church.
Yeah, you mentioned that. People had different ideas of what church meant.
Exactly. It caused confusion, sometimes pushback, people asking things like, hey, Jesus said he would build the church. Why are you guys focused on doing something Jesus said he'd do?
That's a fair question, actually.
It was seen as legitimate. So after a lot of talk, they decided to shift the main term they use to describe their part in it all.
And that's where DMM comes in more strongly. Disciple-making movement.
Precisely. They felt DMM better reflected their role, aligning directly with the Great Commission's command. Go and make disciples.
With the understanding that those disciples would then reproduce.
Yes, that's the key implication. Making disciples who make disciples. The shift put the spotlight back on the process, the making and multiplying of disciples, rather than just the outcome of churches being planted.
So if DMM is the process, what does that actually look like on the ground? What are the steps the source lays out?
Okay, the source describes these core activities that seem to catalyze DMMs. It starts with believers who are obeying Christ, intentionally training others, training them to become what they call contagious disciple makers.
Contagious disciple makers. And what do?
They're disciplined to pray, first off, then to actively go out and engage lost communities, and critically, find these persons of peace.
Right. The source called them God-prepared people. People in a community who are open, receptive to the gospel message for the first time.
Exactly. Then these disciple makers work with those persons of peace and their networks, helping them discover Jesus.
Yeah.
Often using something called discovery groups.
Which are described as like inductive group Bible studies.
Yeah, a specific method really designed to guide people from zero knowledge towards loving and obeying Christ.
Okay, makes sense. What comes after that?
From there, it flows naturally. Baptizing the new believers, helping them form into faith communities, which they call church, and then, crucially, mentoring new leaders from within those freshly formed groups.
That whole sequence, it's built around reproduction at every single step, isn't it? Finding people, discipling them, forming groups, raising leaders who can repeat the process.
That's the idea.
So how do DMM and CPM fit together then in this picture?
The source connects them very clearly. Basically, as Jesus works through people who are obeying him, doing this intentional disciple-making stuff.
The DMM.
The DMM process becomes a CPM. The disciple-making movement is the engine, you could say. The church-planting movement is the visible result of that engine running effectively.
And the source emphasizes, ultimately, Jesus gets the glory for it all.
Always.
Now, there's a really important point the source makes, helping us sort through maybe some noise out there about these terms.
Yes. A key observation.
Yeah.
Lots of people use the terms CPM or DMM now, but they might just be putting a new label on whatever they were already doing.
Without actually changing their methods to match this DMM process.
Potentially, yes. So the source gives a kind of litmus test. How do you know if it's a real movement in the way they're describing it?
It's a test.
It's whether the results you're seeing are the direct outcome of that obedience-based discipleship process, where you see consistent multi-generational reproduction.
Okay, so disciples making disciples.
They'll make disciples.
Yeah.
Leaders equipping leaders who equip leaders. Churches starting groups that become churches that start more groups. If that deep reproduction is happening,
Then you're looking at a DMM in action, which results in a CPM.
that's the argument. And the flip side is the crucial qualifier. If that consistent multi-generational reproduction isn't happening,
Then no matter what label you put on it.
it's not really a movement in this specific sense. True DMM methodology, as laid out here, requires being really disciplined, educating, training, mentoring people, not just to know Jesus' commands, but to obey all of them,
And the source adds that phrase.
regardless of consequences. That commitment to obedience, even when costly, is highlighted as a key element.
Okay, let's loop back to where we started this whole thing, this idea of rapid growth. The source gives us this really counterintuitive take.
It really does. It insists the results are not quick, fundamentally not quick.
It just look rapid.
Exactly, because of the power of exponential growth down the line. But the underlying work, anything but fast.
So what's the actual time scale involved at the start?
Well, the author shares from their experience, when you're doing the foundational work that leads to a visible movement, it typically takes, get this, 2 to 4 years just to disciple and develop one single leader to the point where they could effectively reproduce.
2 to 4 years for one leader. Wow, that sounds incredibly slow.
It is slow up front. And the source mentions their own mission agency was basically ready to discipline them for failure during those early years.
Because nothing looked like it was happening.
Right. No visible or measurable results for the first 4 years in that resistant group. Imagine the pressure. But under the surface, what was happening?
That slow work of equipping.
Intense investment. The author was pouring into 5 key leaders during those years. And those 5, over the next few years, equipped 25 more, who then equipped hundreds.
Ah, okay. So the visible church multiplication only kicked in after those leaders were equipped and started reproducing themselves.
Exactly. More equipped leaders eventually meant more churches starting. The source says every leader has years invested in him or her by other leaders.
So the multiplication wasn't magic. It was the payoff from that slow, deep investment maturing in the first wave of leaders.
That's the picture. The author plainly states nothing is quick. It only looks fast on a chart later on because you have more and more leaders being produced exponentially through this slow, deliberate process.
Which brings us back to that paradox.
Rapid multiplication really isn't rapid. We go slowly, but appear to go fast. That's the quote.
So the strategy is invest years in one person, aiming for them to reach and train many, and keep adding and equipping new reproducing leaders year after year.
That's the core idea, which leads right into the central principle, the cause of these movements, according to the source.
What's the main takeaway then if you want to see a DMM start?
If you want a disciple-making movement anywhere, the engine that results in a church planting movement, the absolute key, based on this source, is you must invest heavily, intensely, for years. In what?
Teaching, training, mentoring leaders.
To obey all the commands of Christ. That's the core activity.
And if you're trying to evaluate something that calls itself a DMM or CPM,
then you need to look past the surface, past the labels, or even the initial numbers. You need to examine the actual process.
The discipleship and leadership equipping engine.
Is that deep, time-intensive investment in developing, reproducing leaders happening? Real, lasting movements prioritize that.
So the final distinction is really clear now.
DMM is causative. It's the process, the engine. CPM is the result, the outcome of that engine running well.
It's less about the name you use.
And much more about whether that engine of multiplication, the disciplined, obedience-based training of reproducing disciples and leaders, is actually running.
Okay, so pulling this all together, what does this deep dive into this specific source mean for you listening? We've kind of traced this journey, haven't we, from just trying to get one church started to understanding this deep process rooted in obedience and, crucially, multiplying leaders.
Yeah, and realizing that the growth, the stuff that looks so fast eventually, isn't some kind of magic trick. It's the outcome, the compounding effect of really intense, often hidden long-term investment in people. Developing people equipped not just to do things, but to reproduce that ability in others.
So understanding this helps cut through maybe some hype. It clarifies what real multiplication looks like, whether you're thinking about spiritual stuff or even, I don't know, growing an organization or developing a team.
It gives you a lens maybe to see the difference between activity that just adds things versus a process that truly multiplies. And it really shines a light on that critical, often overlooked, deep work of investing in others.
Challenges that desire for a quick fix, maybe.
Definitely. It points towards disciplined, intentional training as the real powerhouse for lasting, compounding growth.
Which leaves us with a final thought, drawing just from the source material. What might it really mean for you to go slowly to go fast in whatever area of growth or influence is important to you right now?
Yeah, where in your own world, your own efforts, might you be maybe overlooking or rushing past that critical, time-consuming investment in developing other people, the very investment which, according to this perspective, is the cause that unlocks the potential for real, lasting multiplication.
Something to definitely mull over.